What if entire civilizations are buried beneath the ocean? By the end of this journey, you will understand why these ancient drowned worlds matter today and what they reveal about our own future. Across the globe, ancient coastlines that once supported thriving human settlements now lie dozens of meters underwater, their stories lost until recently. As ice sheets melted after the last ice age, rising seas drowned vast inhabited landscapes, forcing societies to adapt, relocate, or vanish. These buried coastlines hold clues about human resilience, migration, and the long-term consequences of climate change. They offer a mirror for our own era of rising seas. Underwater archaeologists are making astonishing discoveries, from submerged forests to entire Mesolithic villages. What secrets lie beneath the North Sea? How did ancient communities cope when their coastlines vanished? This investigative journey will trace how sea level rise reshaped human settlement patterns across thousands of years and every continent. What would it feel like to watch your homeland disappear beneath the ocean 20,000 years ago? Sea levels stood roughly 120 meters lower than they do today, exposing vast stretches of continental shelf that now lie hidden beneath the waves. What we think of as the edge of the land was not a fixed boundary. It was a shifting frontier, expanding and retreating with the pulse of ice ages. During the last glacial maximum, enormous ice sheets locked up so much water that coastlines extended far out into what is now open ocean. Entire regions that appear as shallow seabeds on modern maps were dry, habitable terrain. These expanded coastlines were not barren or inhospitable, quite the opposite. They were among the most productive landscapes on Earth. The exposed shelves were flat, fertile plains, often crisscrossed by rivers and dotted with lakes. They supported rich ecosystems from grasslands to woodlands, teeming with game and edible plants. For human communities living at the time, these coastal lowlands were prime real estate. They offered easy access to marine resources, fresh water, and favorable climates. People built settlements, established trade routes, and migrated along these now submerged corridors. One of the most dramatic features of this ancient geography was the network of land bridges that connected landmasses we consider separate today. The Bering Land Bridge, for instance, linked Asia to North America, allowing the first human populations to enter the Americas. The British Isles were joined to mainland Europe, and much of Southeast Asia formed a single landmass called Sunda, where early humans thrived. These were not temporary ice crossings but broad, stable plains that existed for thousands of years. They were highways of human movement and exchange. To truly grasp the scale of what was lost, we have to understand that these territories were not marginal edges of the inhabited world. They were central to the lives of ancient peoples. The coastline we see today is merely a snapshot, a temporary high water mark in a much longer story. Ice Age geography reveals that humans have always lived with a dynamic shoreline, one that shifts dramatically over generations, but then the ice began to melt. As the planet warmed, colossal ice sheets collapsed and released staggering volumes of water. The seas rose not slowly and steadily, but in pulses, sometimes catastrophically. What had been thriving lowlands became flooded basins. Rivers turned into bays, land bridges disappeared beneath the waves, entire landscapes were swallowed in the span of a few human lifetimes. The communities that had called these coastlines home faced a choice that echoes down through history: adapt, move, or vanish. Sea level rise did not happen at a steady, predictable pace. Instead, it came in violent surges known as meltwater pulses, and the most dramatic of these was Meltwater Pulse 1A, roughly 14,600 years ago. In a geological blink of an eye, sea levels jumped by about 16 meters in just 3 to 5 centuries. To put that in human terms, imagine watching the ocean rise roughly a meter every 20 years, generation after generation. Coastlines that your grandparents knew as dry land became tidal flats, then open water within a single lifetime. The cause was the collapse of unstable ice sheets. As the planet warmed, massive blocks of ice broke apart and slid into the ocean, unleashing colossal outburst floods. One theory points to a catastrophic drainage of a giant glacial lake in North America, sending a wall of freshwater surging into the sea. Another suggests the rapid disintegration of the Antarctic ice sheet. Either way, the result was the same. The world's coastlines redrew themselves faster than any ecosystem or human society could keep up. Forests were drowned in place, their stumps and root systems preserved perfectly under sediment. Entire valleys became bays. Low-lying plains that had supported villages for centuries turned into underwater graveyards. For the people living along these shores, there was no time to gradually adapt. There was only the choice to flee inland or perish. Archaeological evidence hints at mass displacement, cultural upheaval, and the rapid formation of new settlement patterns as survivors clustered on higher ground. These meltwater pulses were not isolated events. They happened several times as the ice sheets retreated, each one leaving behind a distinct submerged landscape. And because the flooding was so fast, the water effectively flash froze entire settlements and ecosystems in place. That is why today, underwater archaeologists find remarkably preserved sites, stone tools still lying where they were dropped, hearths intact, even footprints pressed into ancient mud. These drowned worlds are time capsules sealed by the rising sea. They offer a direct window into a moment when the planet changed, and humans had to change with it. Each pulse created a new layer of submerged terrain, stacked like chapters in a sunken history book. The question is, what happened to the people who survived? How did they rebuild when the sea kept rising? The answer lies scattered across the seabed, waiting to be read. One of those sunken chapters lies beneath the North Sea, and it is known as Doggerland. This vast low-lying plain once stretched from what is now the east coast of Britain all the way to the Netherlands and Denmark. For thousands of years, it was the heart of Europe, a rich landscape of marshland, rivers, and forests that supported generations of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. At its peak, Doggerland was not a marginal edge of the continent but a central hub, a place where people lived, traded, and migrated freely across land that is now open water. The evidence for this drowned world comes from many directions. Fishermen trawling the North Sea have long pulled up unexpected treasures in their nets. Alongside the usual catch, they have found ancient bones of mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses, carved antler tools, and even a preserved human skull, dating back roughly 10,000 years. These discoveries were puzzling at first, but they pointed to something extraordinary. The shallow seabed was once dry land. Over the decades, seismic surveys and sediment cores have mapped the ancient landscape in stunning detail. They reveal a network of river valleys, lakes, and hill ranges, all lying just a few meters below the water. One of the most remarkable features is a massive ancient river system, the remains of a waterway that drained much of northern Europe. For the people of Doggerland, life was abundant. The marshes teemed with fish and waterfowl, the forests offered deer and wild boar, and the rivers provided easy travel. Archaeologists have found evidence of seasonal camps where families gathered to process food, make tools, and bury their dead. It was a stable, thriving world. But that world came to a sudden and violent end. Around 6,200 years before the Common Era, a catastrophic event struck the coast of Norway. A massive underwater landslide known as the Storegga Slide sent a colossal tsunami racing across the North Sea. The wave, estimated to have been several meters high, crashed into the low-lying plains of Doggerland, inundating vast areas in a matter of hours. For the communities living there was no warning and no time to escape. The tsunami wiped out the remaining lowlands, pushing the shoreline inland by dozens of kilometers. What had once been a broad land bridge connecting Britain to Europe became a choppy sea. Britain became an island. The survivors, if any, would have fled to higher ground, carrying the memory of their submerged homeland into new territories. Over the following centuries, the slowly rising seas completed the drowning. Doggerland faded from memory, becoming a legend whispered among coastal tribes. Today, its remnants lie beneath the waves, a silent archive of a lost way of life. This pattern of sudden inundation and forced migration was not unique to Northern Europe. Similar drowning events happened across the globe, each one reshaping human settlement in its own way. The same rising seas that drowned Doggerland also swallowed a continent in Southeast Asia. Geologists call it Sundaland, a vast expanse of exposed continental shelf that once connected Borneo, Sumatra, Java, and the Malay Peninsula into a single landmass larger than Europe. During the last ice age, when sea levels were more than 100 meters lower, this region was not a scattering of islands but a broad, low-lying plain, crisscrossed by mighty rivers and fringed by dense tropical forests. It was a heartland for early human populations, a place where people migrated, settled, and thrived for tens of thousands of years. For the communities living there, Sundaland was home. Its rivers provided fresh water and transport, its forests offered game and plants, and its coastlines teemed with marine life. But when the ice sheets began to melt and the seas rose, this entire world vanished beneath the waves, transforming a continent into an archipelago. The Sunda Shelf today lies under shallow waters, its ancient landscapes hidden beneath sediment and coral. Yet its story is crucial for understanding how early humans spread across the globe. Sundaland was a critical corridor for the first great migration out of Africa and into Australia. As people moved eastward along the southern coast of Asia, they reached the edge of the exposed shelf. From there, they faced a daunting challenge. Beyond Sundaland lay the deep ocean trenches of the Wallace Line, a biological and geographical boundary that separated the Asian landmass from the islands of Wallacea and the continent of Sahul, which then included Australia and New Guinea. Crossing that line required boats, and the rising seas made the journey even more difficult. As the waters climbed, the distances between islands grew, and the once continuous land bridge fractured into scattered pockets of habitable terrain. But people adapted. Archaeological evidence suggests that seafaring skills emerged very early, perhaps over 50,000 years ago, allowing humans to island hop across the widening gaps. The submergence of Sundaland did not stop the peopling of Australia, but it did reshape it. Coastal settlements that had lined the now drowned plains were lost, forcing populations to retreat inland or develop new maritime lifestyles. The modern geography of Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines is a direct result of this ancient flooding, a mosaic of islands that once formed a single land. Underwater archaeology in this region is still in its early stages, but it has already yielded remarkable clues. Fishermen and dredging operations have brought up stone tools from the seabed, some of them dating back tens of thousands of years. Sonar surveys have revealed ancient river channels and submerged lake beds matching the prehistoric topography. One particularly promising site lies in the Gulf of Thailand, where a drowned river valley hints at a lost settlement. Researchers believe that intact human sites may still lie preserved under layers of sediment, waiting to be discovered. Unlike the cold waters of the North Sea, the warm tropical seas of Sundaland present a different set of challenges for preservation, but also unique opportunities. Each discovery offers a glimpse into a world that was slowly erased by the sea. The people of Sundaland did not disappear entirely. They became the ancestors of the modern populations of island Southeast Asia and Australia, carrying with them the languages, technologies, and traditions that had developed on the sunken plains. Their experience of loss and adaptation, of watching their homeland dissolve into the ocean, echoes across millennia, and it raises a haunting question. What other drowned worlds lie waiting beneath the waves, and what will they teach us about our own relationship with a changing planet? Beneath the warm waters of the Persian Gulf lies a forgotten valley. 12,000 years ago, where ships now sail and oil platforms rise, there was a broad, fertile basin. Rivers carved through its interior, feeding lakes that sparkled under a dry sky. This was the Gulf Oasis, a freshwater haven that drew people and animals from across a parched landscape. The climate back then was harsh, with long droughts that made much of the region uninhabitable. But here, in this low-lying corridor, water was reliable. The Gulf Oasis became a refugium, a place where life could hold on while the surrounding deserts expanded. For early human populations, it was a sanctuary. They built seasonal camps along the shores of ancient lakes, hunted the game that gathered at the water's edge, and fished in the rivers. Stone tools found on the seabed today, brought up by dredging or spotted by divers, confirm that people were here for thousands of years, but that world did not last. Around 12,000 years ago, as the last ice age ended, the seas began their relentless climb. The Persian Gulf, which had been a valley, started to fill. The process was gradual at first, then accelerating with meltwater pulses. What had been a lush lowland became a shallow sea, swallowing the campsites, the lakes, and the riverbanks layer by layer. The flooding was not instantaneous, but over a few centuries, the entire basin was submerged. The modern coastline of the Gulf, with its familiar shape, is a recent creation. The people who lived in the oasis had to move. They did not vanish. They retreated to higher ground on all sides, into what is now Iran, Iraq, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Levant. This migration may have been one of the most consequential movements in human history. The refugees from the flooded Gulf Oasis carried with them knowledge of freshwater management, seasonal hunting, and tool making. They arrived in regions that were already changing, where wild grains grew and animals were beginning to be domesticated. Some researchers argue that this influx of people, displaced by rising seas, helped spark the Neolithic revolution in the Fertile Crescent. The timing lines up. The first farming villages appear in the hills above the Gulf just as the valley below disappears. Could it be that the loss of one paradise spurred the creation of another? Evidence from the seafloor supports the hypothesis. Scientists have mapped ancient river channels and lake beds beneath the Gulf's waters. They have recovered peat deposits, the compressed remains of marsh plants that date back to the time when the basin was dry. Sonar surveys reveal what appear to be buried shorelines and river terraces, and the stone tools, some of them unmistakably human-made, have been found scattered across the seabed. These artifacts are clues waiting for a full archaeological campaign, but the Gulf is a challenging place to work with strong currents, limited visibility, and heavy shipping traffic. Still, researchers consider it a high priority for underwater survey, a potential treasure trove of prehistoric settlements. The story of the Gulf Oasis reminds us that flooding did not just drown landscapes. It set entire human populations in motion, reshaping the course of civilization. The people who once called that valley home did not simply disappear. They adapted, moved, and carried their culture into new territories, becoming part of the great transformation that led to farming, cities, and the world we know today. Their sunken homeland holds a key to understanding how environmental change can drive human innovation, and it raises a question that lingers as the waters continue to rise in our own century. What will future generations say about the coastlines we are losing now? The Black Sea holds one of the most debated flood stories in prehistory. Around 5,600 years before the Common Era, a dramatic event may have reshaped the region forever. The hypothesis, first proposed by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman, suggests that the Black Sea was once a vast freshwater lake, isolated from the world's oceans. Its surface sat roughly 150 meters below the level of the rising Mediterranean Sea. Between them lay only a narrow strip of land at the Bosporus Strait. Then, as the Mediterranean continued to climb, the sea finally broke through. According to Ryan and Pittman, the breach was not a slow trickle but a catastrophic deluge. Saltwater roared through the Bosporus with the force of 200 Niagara Falls, flooding the low-lying freshwater basin at an astonishing rate. In their model, the waters rose by as much as 15 centimeters per day, drowning roughly 100,000 square kilometers of land in less than 2 years. That is an area about the size of Iceland, swallowed in the span of a single season. For any Neolithic communities living along the ancient lake shore, there would have been no time to prepare. Entire settlements, fields, and forests would have vanished beneath the advancing saltwater. If the hypothesis is correct, this event would have been one of the most dramatic natural disasters in human memory. It would have displaced thousands of people, forcing them to flee inland and carry stories of a great flood into the surrounding regions. Some scholars have even suggested that this catastrophe may be the origin of the flood myths that appear in ancient texts, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the biblical story of Noah. But not everyone agrees with the catastrophic interpretation. A growing body of evidence points to a more gradual rise. Critics argue that the Bosporus may have opened slowly over centuries, not in a single violent pulse. Sediment cores from the Black Sea floor show layers that can be read like a diary. Some cores reveal a sharp transition from freshwater to saltwater species, which supports a rapid event. Others show a more mixed sequence, hinting at a prolonged period of change. The debate remains open, and each side continues to gather new data. Regardless of which model is correct, one thing is clear. The Black Sea's shoreline shifted dramatically, and human populations had to adapt. The submerged landscape of this ancient freshwater lake is still being explored. Sonar surveys have mapped buried river channels and terraces that once lay above water. Underwater archaeologists have discovered a remarkably preserved wooden structure off the Turkish coast, what appears to be a dwelling or a platform, sitting in about 90 meters of water. Its timbers, still intact after millennia, suggest that people lived and worked on the shores of that prehistoric lake. The site is a rare and fragile window into a lost world. If the flooding was sudden, those structures would have been abandoned in haste, leaving tools and hearths exactly as they were. If gradual, the occupants would have had time to dismantle and move their homes, leaving fewer traces. Every new discovery adds a piece to the puzzle. The Black Sea flood story is not just a scientific debate. It is a reminder that the rising seas of the past did not simply drown empty landscapes. They flooded inhabited places, homes, and hunting grounds, rewriting the human map of the region. And as scientists continue to explore these depths, the mystery deepens, waiting for the next clue to surface. Off the coast of Israel, a Neolithic village rests silently beneath the waves. Its name is Atlit Yam, and it is one of the best-preserved submerged settlements ever discovered. Dating to around 7,000 before the Common Era, this ancient community sat on the shoreline of a Mediterranean that was still rising after the last ice age. Today it lies 8 to 12 meters underwater, sealed by sand and sediment for millennia. Marine archaeologists first stumbled upon it in the 1980s, and what they found changed the way we understand how coastal societies responded to environmental pressure. The site covers an area roughly the size of a modern city block. Divers have mapped the remains of several rectangular stone houses, their foundations still visible, with doorways and courtyards intact. The builders used local fieldstones, stacking them without mortar, and the walls once supported roofs made of wood and thatch. In the center of the village, excavators uncovered a deep stone-lined well, a remarkable feature that tells a clear story of changing conditions. The well was originally dug when the water table was fresh and drinkable, but as the sea crept closer, salt water began to seep into the aquifer. Layers of sediment inside the well show a gradual increase in marine shells and salt-tolerant organisms. The villagers tried to adapt, perhaps digging the well deeper, but eventually the freshwater turned brackish, then unusable. That well provides a timeline of failure, a record of a community watching its most essential resource become poisoned by the advancing ocean. Inside the houses and scattered across the seafloor, archaeologists recovered organic material that rarely survives on dry land. Underwater, the absence of oxygen and the protective blanket of sand kept these items perfectly preserved. They found animal bones from sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs, evidence that the people of Atlit Yam were early farmers who kept livestock. They also discovered the bones of wild deer and gazelle, showing that hunting still supplemented their diet. Fish bones and hooks reveal a reliance on the sea, but the most stunning finds were the plant remains. Archaeologists recovered hundreds of seeds from emmer wheat, barley, lentils, and flax. This was a settled agricultural community, one that planted crops, harvested grains, and wove linen. The preservation was so good that scientists could even analyze the wear patterns on stone tools, revealing that they had been used to grind flour. Yet perhaps the most poignant discoveries are the human burials. Several skeletons were found within the village, some buried in flexed positions, others alongside grave goods such as flint blades and animal offerings. These individuals were not forgotten. Their resting place lay within the community they helped build, and when the sea finally forced the village to be abandoned, those graves were left behind. There is no evidence of a sudden catastrophe here, no tsunami or storm. Instead, the abandonment appears to have been gradual, a retreat spanning perhaps generations. Families moved inland, house by house, field by field, as the shoreline crept higher and the well turned salty. The decision to leave was not made in a single moment but over decades of slow, agonizing loss. Atlit Yam offers a direct window into the human side of ancient sea level rise. Here was a thriving settlement with a well-organized society, domesticated animals, and a stable food supply. Yet the rising water was an inexorable force that no amount of effort could overcome. The villagers adapted as long as they could, and then they left. Their abandonment shaped where later communities formed, pushing settlement patterns inland and onto higher ground along the Carmel coast. The lessons from Atlit Yam echo our own century, when coastlines are again shifting and communities must decide how long to hold on before retreating. And Atlit Yam is not alone beneath the Mediterranean. From the drowned Neolithic villages of the Greek Argolid to the submerged harbor cities of the Egyptian Delta, the sea hides dozens of similar sites, each one a chapter in the same global story. The preservation offshore opens a unique archive of prehistoric life, one that is only now being read. Off the southern coast of Greece, the oldest known submerged city rests beneath the waves. Its name is Pavlopetri, and it dates back more than 5,000 years to the early Bronze Age. While Atlit Yam gives us a Neolithic farming village, Pavlopetri offers something far more complex. This was a genuine urban center, a planned settlement with streets, buildings, and a layout that would not look out of place in a later Greek city. The ruins sprawl across an area roughly the size of several football fields, lying in shallow water just a few meters deep. What makes Pavlopetri so extraordinary is its preservation. Because the site was never buried by sediment, the stone foundations of walls, doorways, and courtyards remain clearly visible, as if the city were simply sleeping beneath a thin veil of water. Divers swimming over the site can trace the outline of at least 15 buildings, connected by a network of streets that run in a grid-like pattern. There are also what appear to be public squares, storage rooms, and even a possible temple or administrative center. Archaeologists estimate that the city was continuously inhabited from around 3000 before the Common Era until about 1100 before the Common Era, a span of nearly 2000 years. That means people lived here through the entire Bronze Age, from the early Minoan period to the end of the Mycenaean era. They watched empires rise and fall, yet their own city slowly succumbed to a different kind of threat. The submergence of Pavlopetri was not caused by a single dramatic event. There is no evidence of an earthquake or a tsunami that toppled its walls in a single night. Instead, the city sank gradually over many centuries due to a combination of tectonic subsidence and the same global sea level rise that had been reshaping coastlines since the last ice age. The land beneath the city was slowly sinking while the sea around it crept higher. It was a long, drawn-out process, one that the residents would have noticed only over generations. A harbor that once gave easy access to the sea might have gradually become too shallow for larger boats. The lower-lying homes may have experienced occasional flooding during storms. Each decade, the waterline inched a little higher. Eventually, the residents made a decision. They abandoned their city, moving inland or to higher ground, leaving behind the stone foundations of their homes and the memory of their streets. The abandonment was likely orderly. People took their valuables, their tools, and their livestock. What they left behind were the heavy stone walls and the layout of the city itself. That layout is what makes Pavlopetri a treasure for archaeologists. Because the city was submerged and never built over by later generations, its original Bronze Age plan is preserved almost exactly as it was when the last inhabitant walked away. To study it without damaging the ruins, researchers turned to technology. In the late 1960s, a team from the University of Cambridge first surveyed the site using traditional methods. But the real breakthrough came decades later with the use of digital photography, sonar scanning, and three-dimensional modeling. Underwater archaeologists swam over every corner of the site, taking thousands of photographs. These images were then stitched together to create a precise map of the city, revealing details that were invisible to the naked eye. The survey was so accurate that it could distinguish between different construction phases, showing how the city expanded and changed over time. All of this was done without a single shovel breaking the seabed. Pavlopetri was mapped without excavation, a non-destructive approach that leaves the site intact for future generations to study with even better technology. This method has become a model for underwater archaeology around the world. Pavlopetri teaches us something important about the history of sea level rise. It is often easy to think of submerged cities as purely prehistoric, lost in the deep past before written history began. But Pavlopetri is from a time when writing already existed, when the great civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia were already flourishing. The fact that a Bronze Age city was slowly swallowed by the sea shows that the problem of rising waters did not end with the Ice Age. It continued through the Age of Empires, and it never really stopped. In some places, like Pavlopetri, the sea won. In others, coastal communities found ways to adapt, building walls, raising foundations, or developing new harbors. The struggle between human settlement and the encroaching ocean is one of the oldest stories in our shared history, and Pavlopetri is one of its most eloquent witnesses. Its silent streets and courtyards, still visible just below the surface, offer a direct connection to a world that chose to move rather than fight a losing battle against the sea. And as we face our own rising waters, that ancient decision feels more relevant than ever. The Baltic Sea holds a different kind of underwater archive. Unlike the Mediterranean or the Persian Gulf, its story is not just about rising waters. It is also about land that rose in response. When the massive ice sheets of northern Europe melted, they had pressed down on the Earth's crust for thousands of years. Once the weight lifted, the land began to spring back, a process geologists call isostatic rebound. In some parts of Scandinavia, the ground has risen by more than 200 meters since the Ice Age ended. But that recovery was not uniform, and it did not happen in isolation. At the same time, the melted ice was pouring back into the oceans, raising sea levels globally. The interplay between these two forces, land rising and water rising, created a constantly shifting coastline that is still moving today. For the Mesolithic people who lived along the shores of the ancient Baltic, this was a world in flux. Around 10,000 years ago, the Baltic was not the brackish sea we know today. It was a vast freshwater lake called the Ancillus Lake, named after a freshwater snail whose fossils are found in its sediments. Its shoreline stretched far beyond modern coastlines, and its waters were rich with fish and waterfowl. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers camped along its edges, taking advantage of the abundant resources. They built temporary shelters, made tools from flint and antler, and left behind traces of their daily lives in the form of discarded bones, charcoal from hearths, and the occasional lost weapon. Because the landscape was slowly sinking or rising in different places, many of those campsites were eventually submerged and then preserved under layers of sediment and cold, low-oxygen water. One of the most remarkable of these sites lies off the coast of southern Sweden, near the town of Rönneholm. Here, archaeologists working just below the surface of a shallow bay have uncovered a Mesolithic settlement that dates back roughly 9,000 years. The preservation is extraordinary. Wooden stakes that once supported shelters still stand upright in the seabed. The remains of fish traps woven from willow branches remain intact. Animal bones, including those of wild boar, deer, and beaver, lie scattered among stone tools and the charred remnants of ancient meals. What makes Rönneholm so valuable is the clarity of its stratigraphy. The layers of sediment are like pages in a book, each one recording a different phase of the shoreline's movement. A layer of peat, formed when the lake was low, sits directly above a layer of sand deposited when the water rose. And in between, archaeologists find the tools and bones that people left behind. It is one of the best preserved windows into a lost coastal world anywhere in Europe. Not far away, in the waters of Hanno Bay, divers have discovered a submerged forest. The remains of ancient trees, some still with their roots attached, lie preserved in the sand. Their trunks, exposed by currents, have been dated to a time when the Baltic was still a lake and the shoreline lay much farther out. Among these stumps, researchers have found antler tools, carefully shaped from red deer antlers, and fragments of leather that have survived because the cold, oxygen-poor waters slowed the decay. One of the most striking finds was a wooden paddle, a tool that its owner likely lost while fishing or traveling across the lake. It is a small, ordinary object, but it speaks directly to a person who lived here 8,000 years ago, someone who knew this landscape as dry ground and open water long before the sea we see today. The exceptional preservation in the Baltic comes down to a combination of factors. The low salinity and cold temperatures limit the bacteria that normally break down organic material. The lack of oxygen in deeper layers also helps. In some places, archaeologists have recovered items that would have vanished almost instantly on land. Baskets, wooden handles, even fragments of nets made from plant fibers have been found. This allows researchers to reconstruct not just the technology of these ancient people, but also their daily routines. We know, for example, that they fished with nets and traps, hunted using bows and arrows with stone-tipped points, and gathered hazelnuts and berries from the forests that lined the lake. We know that they moved seasonally, following the migration of animals and the spawning of fish, and we know that they adapted to the slow but relentless changes in their environment. As the land rose in some areas, new islands appeared. As the water rose in others, old campsites became submerged. The Mesolithic people of the Baltic did not simply flee the rising water. They learned to read the landscape and shift their settlements accordingly, generation after generation. This pattern of adaptation is part of a wider story across northern Eurasia. From the British Isles to the Russian plain, post-glacial hunter-gatherers faced the same challenge. Their world was unstable, with coastlines that redrew themselves every few centuries. They responded by developing flexible lifestyles, moving between seasonal camps, using boats to cross new waterways, and exploiting a wide range of resources. The Baltic's underwater sites give us a uniquely detailed view of that world, frozen in time by the very waters that drowned it. And as these sites continue to yield their secrets, they remind us that human resilience is not a modern invention. It is as old as the changing shorelines themselves. What else might lie beneath those cold, dark waves, waiting for the right discovery to bring it back into the light? Off the coast of Japan, a different kind of underwater archive tells the story of the Jomon people. For roughly 10,000 years, from around 14,000 before the Common Era, the Jomon culture flourished along the archipelago's abundant shorelines. They were among the earliest known societies to develop a sedentary lifestyle, building permanent villages, crafting intricate pottery, and relying heavily on the sea's bounty. Their world was one of rich coastal forests, sheltered inlets, and productive fishing grounds. But as the global ice sheets continued to melt and sea levels climbed, much of that world was slowly swallowed by the rising water. Today, many Jomon sites lie submerged in shallow coastal waters or at the bottom of ancient lakes, preserving a remarkably detailed record of how one of the world's oldest pottery-making cultures adapted to a changing planet. One of the most important of these submerged sites is the Torihama Shell Midden, located in Fukui Prefecture on the western coast of Honshu. A shell midden is essentially an ancient trash heap, but for archaeologists it is a treasure chest. The layers of discarded shells, fish bones, and animal remains preserved in the waterlogged sediments offer a direct window into the Jomon diet and environment. At Torihama, researchers have uncovered thousands of shells from clams, oysters, and scallops, along with the bones of sea bream, tuna, and even dolphins. The sheer volume suggests that the people living here harvested the ocean intensively, season after season, generation after generation. They also left behind tools made from bone and antler, including fishhooks, harpoons, and net sinkers, all carefully shaped for the tasks of catching and processing marine life. The midden itself was originally located close to the shoreline, but as the sea rose, the site became waterlogged and eventually submerged, sealing its contents in a layer of mud that prevented decay. But the Jomon did not simply live off the sea. They also built substantial structures on land. In the shallow waters of Lake Biwa, Japan's largest and oldest lake, archaeologists have discovered something extraordinary. Submerged wooden platforms and the remains of pit houses, the characteristic semi-subterranean dwellings of the Jomon period, lie preserved beneath the lake's surface. These structures date back roughly 6,000 years, a time when the lake's shoreline was significantly lower than it is today. The wooden posts driven into the ancient ground still stand upright, their pointed ends intact. Researchers believe that these were part of a lakeside village, a settlement designed to take advantage of the rich freshwater resources of the lake, while also offering protection from the rising coastal waters. The discovery of dugout canoes carved from single tree trunks, some of them measuring several meters in length, confirms that the Jomon were skilled boat builders. These vessels allowed them to travel along the coast, fish in deeper waters, and maintain connections between communities that were increasingly separated by advancing shorelines. What makes the Jomon case so revealing is the evidence of sophisticated adaptation. As the sea crept higher, the Jomon did not simply flee inland. They developed new technologies and refined their existing ones. The fishing gear found at Torihama and other submerged sites shows a remarkable diversity of forms, from simple bone hooks to complex composite fish spears. The dugout canoes were not just for transport, they were essential tools for accessing the offshore fishing grounds that became more important as the coastline retreated. And the German constructed elaborate shell mounds, sometimes intentionally building them up to create elevated platforms for their homes, raising the living surface above the encroaching tide. In some areas, they even built stone-lined channels to manage freshwater runoff and prevent erosion. This was not a passive response to environmental change. It was an active, creative struggle to hold on to a way of life that depended on the coast. The German also left behind a legacy that speaks to the emotional and cultural dimensions of loss. Their pottery, some of the oldest known in the world, often features elaborate designs and symbolic motifs. Clay figurines, known as dogu, have been found in submerged contexts, hinting at rituals connected to the sea or to the spirits of the land they were losing. These objects suggest that the rising waters were not merely a practical problem but a force that reshaped their worldview, their ceremonies, and their understanding of their place in the world. The German story is a reminder that even on geologically active islands, where earthquakes and volcanoes were constant threats, the slow, relentless creep of the sea was a challenge of a different kind, one that could not be outrun but had to be met with ingenuity and resilience. And as researchers continue to explore the submerged shores of Japan, new discoveries await, each one adding another layer to the long history of human adaptation to a planet in flux. Half a world away, another drowned plain holds the story of a continent's first inhabitants. During the Ice Age, what we now call Australia and New Guinea were not separate islands. They were joined by a vast expanse of exposed continental shelf known as the Sahul Shelf. This landmass stretched for thousands of kilometers, connecting the rugged coast of modern Australia to the mountain ranges of New Guinea and the island of Tasmania. For the Aboriginal peoples who first arrived on this ancient continent more than 65,000 years ago, these low-lying plains were not a marginal edge but a heartland, a place rich with resources and vital for their earliest settlements. The Sahul Shelf was a corridor for human movement. As the first seafarers crossed from the islands of Wallacea, they landed on shores that are now underwater. From there, they spread southward along the ancient coastlines, following rivers that meandered across the broad plains. The landscape was a mosaic of grasslands, woodlands, and wetlands, teeming with kangaroos, wallabies, and other game, while estuaries and lagoons offered fish, shellfish, and waterfowl. It was a land of abundance, and the people who lived there developed deep knowledge of its cycles, its seasons, and its spirits. Today, the evidence of that lost world lies hidden beneath the waves. Archaeologists have recovered stone tools from the seafloor off the coast of Western Australia, some of them dating back to the earliest periods of human occupation. These tools were not just random flakes, they were carefully shaped scrapers and spear points made by hands that knew exactly where to strike the stone. Sonar surveys have mapped ancient river channels that once carved through the Sahul Shelf, their paths now buried under layers of sediment. In some places, the sonar reveals what appear to be former lake beds and terraces, places where people might have set up seasonal camps. But the most powerful evidence comes from the oral traditions of Aboriginal peoples themselves. Stories passed down through countless generations speak of times when the sea was much farther away, when islands now surrounded by water were connected to the mainland. Some narratives describe the drowning of ancestral lands, a great flood that swallowed the hunting grounds and forced people to retreat to higher ground. These stories are not myths in the modern sense. They are living memories encoded in language and ceremony that preserve the experience of real environmental change. For the Aboriginal custodians, the submerged landscape is not a lost civilization to be excavated. It is a part of their living heritage, a place where the ancestors still reside. One particularly significant site lies off the coast of Port Jackson, the area around modern Sydney. There, divers have found evidence of ancient campsites on the seabed, with stone tools and hearthstones scattered across what was once a riverbank. The sea level here has risen roughly 50 meters since the last ice age, drowning the coastal plains where generations of Aboriginal people lived. These submerged sites are fragile and difficult to access, but they hold the potential to reveal the earliest coastal migration routes into the continent. They could tell us when and how people first moved along the southeastern coast, adapting to a landscape that was itself in constant flux. The rising seas that swallowed the Sahul shelf did more than drown real estate. They reshaped the human map of the region. As the water climbed, the land bridges that connected Australia to New Guinea and Tasmania were severed. Populations that had once shared a continuous territory became isolated on separate islands. Over thousands of years, those separated groups developed their own distinct languages, artistic traditions, and social structures. The incredible linguistic and cultural diversity of Aboriginal Australia, with hundreds of distinct languages spoken before European contact, is in part a result of this post-glacial isolation. Each language, each songline, each unique way of understanding the land bears the imprint of that ancient separation. The Sahul Shelf remains one of the least explored underwater landscapes in the world. Its waters are often murky, its currents strong, and its depths challenging for traditional archaeological methods, but new technologies are opening doors. Autonomous underwater vehicles can now map large areas of the seabed with high-resolution sonar, revealing subtle features that might be ancient shorelines or even human structures. As these tools become more accessible, researchers are hopeful that they will find not just scattered tools but intact settlements, preserved in the same way as Doggerland or Atlit Yam. Each discovery would add another piece to the long and often overlooked story of how the first Australians adapted to a planet that would not stop changing. The most consequential of all Ice Age land bridges lies beneath the Bering Sea. This was not a narrow strip of exposed rock. It was a vast lowland region, in some places stretching up to 1,600 kilometers from north to south, a territory larger than the entire modern state of Alaska. Geologists call it Beringia, and for thousands of years it was a rich, grassy plain, dotted with lakes and crossed by slow-moving rivers. It was not a desolate ice field but a productive landscape, home to herds of mammoths, bison, and horses, and the people who followed them. That landscape served as the gateway for the first human entry into the Americas. During the last ice age, when sea levels were more than 100 meters lower, Beringia connected Siberia to Alaska, forming a continuous land corridor. The early inhabitants of northeastern Asia moved eastward across this plain, perhaps following the migrating herds or simply expanding their territory generation by generation. They did not know they were crossing a land bridge. To them, it was simply their home, a vast, open country that stretched to the horizon. Over centuries, they pushed deeper into what is now Alaska, and from there, they spread southward along the coast and through interior corridors. But the story is not that simple. For decades, archaeologists debated the exact route of that first migration. The traditional model pointed to an ice-free corridor that opened between the great ice sheets in interior Canada, allowing people to walk directly south. But newer evidence has shifted attention to a different pathway, the coastal route. This theory proposes that the first Americans did not march through the interior. Instead, they moved along the now submerged Pacific coastline, traveling in boats or along the shore, exploiting the rich marine resources of the kelp forests and estuaries that fringed the ancient coast. That coastline, like the Bering Land Bridge itself, is now underwater, drowned by the same rising seas that closed the gateway. The coastal route is compelling because it explains how people could have reached the southern parts of the Americas remarkably early, well before the interior ice-free corridor opened. Archaeological sites like Monte Verde in southern Chile, dating back roughly 14,500 years, suggest that people were already living far south while much of northern North America was still locked under ice. The only way they could have gotten there that quickly is by moving along the coast, but the evidence for that coastal migration is frustratingly scarce, precisely because the ancient shoreline is now buried under hundreds of feet of water. Underwater archaeology in the Bering Sea and along the Pacific coast of North America is among the most challenging on the planet. The waters are cold, remote, and often treacherous. The seafloor is deep and currents can be brutal. The areas that were once dry land are now far offshore, sometimes dozens of kilometers from the modern coast. Surveying these depths requires advanced sonar technology, robotic submarines, and a great deal of patience. Even then, finding traces of human activity is like searching for a needle in a vast, dark haystack. Organic materials like bone, wood, and fiber rarely survive the long immersion in cold, oxygenated water. Stone tools are more durable, but they are small and easily scattered by currents or buried under sediment. Despite these obstacles, researchers have gathered tantalizing clues. In the Bering Sea, sonar surveys have revealed ancient river channels and lake basins that match the topography of Ice Age Beringia. In some places, divers have recovered stone tools from the seabed, though their exact age and origin remain debated. Off the coast of British Columbia, marine archaeologists have mapped submerged forests and ancient shorelines that date back to the time when the first coastal migrants would have passed through. One promising area is the Haida Gwaii archipelago, where the continental shelf drops off steeply, creating a narrow band of submerged terrain that may have served as a refuge during the Ice Age. Underwater excavations there have uncovered a few stone artifacts, but nothing that conclusively proves a coastal migration route. The most compelling evidence remains indirect. Genetic studies of modern indigenous peoples show that the founding populations of the Americas diverged from their Asian ancestors roughly 20,000 years ago, a time when Beringia was still dry land. Linguistic and cultural patterns also hint at an ancient coastal dispersal, with some of the oldest distinct language families found along the Pacific Northwest coast. These are circumstantial clues, but they point in the same direction. The first Americans likely arrived by sea, following a shoreline that has since vanished beneath the waves. Then, around 11,000 years ago, the rising seas finally closed the door. The Bering Land Bridge was inundated, and the Americas became isolated from Asia for the first time in tens of thousands of years. The people who had crossed that plain or paddled along its coast were now cut off from their ancestral homeland. The sea that had once been a distant horizon became a permanent barrier. The gateway was sealed, and the two continents went their separate ways, developing distinct cultures and histories for millennia. Today, the remains of that gateway lie hidden under the cold waters of the Bering Sea. No grand ruins mark its location, no stone cities or carved monuments, but the submerged plains of Beringia are more than a footnote in prehistory. They are the place where one chapter of the human story ended and another began. As technology improves, archaeologists hope to unlock its secrets, finding the actual campsites, hearths, and tools of the people who walked that lost country. Each new discovery would not only illuminate the peopling of the Americas, but also remind us that the boundaries between continents are not fixed. They shift with the climate, and the stories of human migration are written on landscapes that the sea can swallow in a geological instant. Off the coast of Southern California, a different kind of gateway opens onto the past. The Channel Islands, a chain of 8 rugged pieces of land, sit like sentinels in the Pacific. Today they are separated from the mainland by a stretch of open ocean, but during the last ice age, the story was entirely different. When sea levels were lower, these islands were much closer to the continent, and the waters between them were shallow channels, not the deep straits we see now. For the earliest peoples who moved along the Pacific coast, these islands were not remote outposts. They were familiar territory, rich with marine life, accessible by simple watercraft, and part of a larger coastal world that has since been swallowed by the rising sea. One of the most remarkable discoveries in this region came from Santa Rosa Island, the second largest of the Channel Islands. There, in a dry canyon called Arlington Springs, archaeologists unearthed a set of human remains that changed the timeline of the Americas. The bones belonged to a woman who lived roughly 13,000 years ago, making her one of the oldest known human individuals in North America. But the real revelation was not just her age. It was where she was found. The Arlington Springs site sits on an island that would have been connected to a much larger landmass during her lifetime. The coastline she knew, the shore where she likely gathered food and raised her family, lies far below the present-day sea level, submerged under dozens of meters of water. Her resting place on the island is a fragment of that lost world, a high point that escaped the flood. The rest of her community's settlements, their seasonal camps, their shell middens, their fire pits, are hidden beneath the waves. These underwater sites hold the key to understanding how the first Americans lived along the Pacific edge, and they are not just a string of isolated camps. They are part of a larger ecological corridor, a highway of life that ran along the coast from Alaska down to South America. Researchers call it the Kelp Highway. The idea is simple yet powerful. At the end of the last ice age, the Pacific coastline was fringed by vast forests of kelp, a fast-growing seaweed that thrives in cold, nutrient-rich waters. This underwater forest teemed with fish, sea mammals, shellfish, and seabirds. It was a stable, predictable food source that required no farming, only knowledge of the tides and the seasons. For people moving southward along the coast, the kelp forest was a supermarket on the edge of the sea. It provided everything they needed to survive and thrive, from protein to materials for tools and shelter. The Kelp Highway was not a road in the modern sense. It was a continuous band of habitat that stretched for thousands of kilometers, offering a route of least resistance for early migrants. Instead of fighting through dense forests or crossing icy mountain passes, they could travel along the shore, living off the ocean's bounty. And because the coastline was slowly rising with the melting ice, the evidence of that journey is now underwater, sealed in the same way as Doggerland or the Sahul Shelf. The Channel Islands were a critical stop along that highway. The shell middens found on the islands today, mounds of discarded shells and bones that accumulated over centuries, are the visible tip of a much larger underwater record. On dry land, archaeologists have uncovered tools, hearths, and the remains of fish, seals, and seabirds, showing that the people who lived here were skilled marine foragers. But the oldest and most important layers, the ones that date to the time when the sea was still rising, are now underwater. To reach them, scientists are turning to advanced technology. Remotely operated vehicles, or ROV, are being deployed to survey the seafloor around the islands. These robotic submarines carry sonar, cameras, and sampling equipment, allowing researchers to map ancient river channels, submerged shorelines, and potential settlement sites. They can detect subtle changes in the seabed that might indicate a buried shell midden or a stone tool scatter. In some areas, sediment cores are being drilled into the ocean floor. These long tubes of mud contain microscopic shells, pollen, and charcoal, providing a detailed record of what the environment looked like when people were living there. A single core can reveal when the sea reached a particular elevation, when the kelp forest shifted, and when human activity first left its mark in the form of fire or discarded food. The search is painstaking. The area to cover is vast, the waters often murky, and the targets small, but the stakes are high. Every discovery brings us closer to understanding the true story of how humans first entered the Americas. Were they exclusively terrestrial wanderers, or were they coastal pioneers who followed the ocean? the evidence from the Channel Islands and the surrounding shelf points strongly to the latter. The Kelp Highway hypothesis, once a speculative idea, is now supported by a growing body of archaeological and genetic data, and the technology to prove it definitively is just now coming into its own. As the ROVs descend into the depths and the sediment cores are brought to the surface, the Pacific may finally give up its secrets, revealing a world of coastal villages, of boats and nets, of people who knew the ocean as their home long before the sea rose and took it from them. The search continues, and every new find reshapes our understanding of the first American stories. The same rising seas that swallowed the Pacific Kelp Highway also reshaped the Caribbean islands. When the last ice age ended and the oceans climbed, the archipelago we know today was a very different place. Many of the islands were larger, connected by shallow land bridges, and the low-lying coastal plains that now lie beneath warm turquoise waters once held thriving settlements. For the earliest inhabitants, this was not a scattered chain of islands but a continuous landscape of forested lowlands, mangrove estuaries, and freshwater springs. Then the water came, slowly at first, then in pulses, drowning those plains and forcing the people who lived there to adapt or move. Their story is written on the seafloor, preserved in places where the conditions are just right. One of the most intriguing and controversial discoveries comes from the waters off Cuba. In the early 21st century, sonar surveys revealed a series of submerged structures at depths of around 2,000 feet. The images showed what appeared to be perfectly geometric stone blocks, arranged in symmetrical patterns, lying on the seabed. Some researchers immediately proposed that these were the remains of a lost city, perhaps even the legendary Atlantis. The idea captured imaginations around the world, but careful analysis by geologists and archaeologists quickly tempered the excitement. The structures, they concluded, were likely natural limestone formations that had fractured and settled into rectangular shapes over millennia. No tools or artifacts were found nearby. No evidence of human activity could be confirmed. The Cuban underwater site remains a fascinating anomaly, a reminder that even in the age of advanced sonar, the deep ocean can still fool us with its own geological artistry. But the search for genuine human sites in the Caribbean has not ended there. It has simply moved to shallower, more accessible waters, where the evidence is far clearer and less controversial. Off the coast of the Dominican Republic, in a freshwater sinkhole known as Manantial de la Aleta, archaeologists made a discovery that changed the understanding of Caribbean prehistory. The site, a deep limestone cavern filled with clear, still water, had been used by the indigenous Taino people for ceremonial purposes long before European contact. But beneath the surface, preserved in the cold, oxygen-poor water, lay something unexpected. Divers found wooden artifacts, including carved bowls, ceremonial stools, and the remains of dugout canoes, all dating back roughly 800 years. They also discovered human remains carefully placed in the cave, likely as part of funerary rituals. The preservation was extraordinary. Wood that would have rotted away in a few decades on the surface remained intact and well preserved. These objects offered a direct window into the daily and spiritual lives of the people who lived on the island before the arrival of Columbus. But the sinkhole itself also held a deeper secret. The water level in the cave had risen over centuries, slowly flooding the chamber. What had once been a dry cave, used for ceremonies and burials, became a submerged sanctuary. The rising sea, driven by the same post-glacial melt that had reshaped coastlines worldwide, had sealed these treasures beneath the water, protecting them from looters and decay. The challenges of underwater archaeology in the Caribbean are as unique as the region itself. The warm, shallow waters accelerate the decomposition of organic materials like wood, bone, and fiber. Bacteria thrive in the tropical heat, breaking down anything that falls to the seabed. Strong currents and storms constantly shift the sand and sediment, burying or scattering artifacts. And the marine life, from coral to crustaceans, can quickly colonize and damage fragile remains. Yet these same conditions also create opportunities. The shallow waters make sites accessible to divers without the need for expensive submersibles. The clear visibility in many areas allows for detailed photography and mapping. And the rapid sedimentation can actually preserve sites, sealing them in a protective layer of sand before decay sets in. It is a race against time and nature, but each successful excavation adds another piece to the puzzle of how humans first settled these islands. When the first people arrived in the Caribbean, roughly 6,000 years ago, they found a world that was still emerging from the Ice Age. The sea was still rising, and the islands were not yet fully formed. They came in dugout canoes navigating across open water from the South American mainland, and they found a landscape of dense forests, rich marine resources, and abundant fresh water. They built settlements along the coast, fishing, gathering shellfish, and hunting the island's unique wildlife. Over centuries, as the sea continued its slow climb, those settlements were lost. The people moved inland, adapting their way of life to a shrinking land area. The rising waters did not stop after the Ice Age ended. They continued more slowly into the Holocene, and the island communities had to keep adjusting. That pattern of adaptation is recorded in the archaeological layers, both on land and underwater. The submerged sites of the Caribbean are not just academic curiosities. They hold the key to understanding the great migration that populated the islands, a journey that eventually led to the emergence of the Taino and Carib cultures, the societies that would first encounter European explorers. By studying the drowned settlements, archaeologists can trace how these early islanders developed new technologies, managed resources, and built complex social structures in a world where the very land beneath their feet was disappearing. Each artifact recovered from the seafloor, a carved wooden bowl, a stone tool, a human bone, is a message from a people who faced a changing planet with creativity and resilience. And as the waters around those islands continue to rise in our own century, their story becomes more than a history lesson. It becomes a warning, a guide, and a mirror. What will future generations find when they look beneath the waves that are swallowing our own coastal cities? The Caribbean's underwater prehistory is not just written in coral and limestone. It is written in the choices of people who refused to let the sea erase them. The memory of those lost worlds did not vanish with the rising seas. Across the globe, indigenous communities carry stories that speak of times when the coastlines lay farther out, when land that is now underwater was once home to their ancestors. These are not abstract myths or mere legends. They are oral archives passed down through countless generations, encoding real events in language that is both poetic and precise. For the Yolngu people of northern Australia, their songlines and dreamtime narratives describe a great flood that swallowed vast stretches of the coastal plain, turning rich hunting grounds into saltwater lagoons. The stories name specific places now beneath the waves where rivers once flowed and ceremonies were held. For decades, Western scholars treated these accounts as symbolic, not historical. But as geological surveys mapped the drowned Sahul shelf, the timelines and locations matched. The oral traditions were describing a real event, the post-glacial sea level rise that submerged a continent-sized landscape. The Yolngu ancestors saw their world shrink, and they encoded that catastrophe in the most durable medium available, human memory. The same pattern appears across the Pacific. In the Solomon Islands, the Bilua people tell of a time when a chain of low-lying islands lay between their homeland and the open ocean. They remember the names of those lost islands, the paths that once connected them, and the families who lived there. Divers have since confirmed that submerged reefs and ancient shorelines exist exactly where the stories place them. The memory of those drowned islands is not a vague recollection of a distant flood, but a detailed map of a landscape that no longer exists. What makes these oral traditions so powerful is their practicality. They are not just stories. They contain information about safe navigation routes, seasonal resources, and environmental warnings. In many cases, they serve as a warning system, reminding younger generations that the sea can rise again. Scientists have begun to treat these oral histories as legitimate data sources, comparing them with ice core records and sediment layers to refine timelines of ancient sea level change. The results are striking. In several cases, the stories accurately describe events that occurred thousands of years ago, matching the known rate of post-glacial meltwater pulses. This is not a matter of belief versus science. It is a convergence of two ways of knowing, each validating the other. The geological record gives us the precise measurements and dates. The oral traditions give us the human experience. They tell us how it felt to watch your homeland disappear, how communities mourned and adapted, and how they turned that loss into cultural identity. The flood narratives of Aboriginal Australia, the submerged islands of the Bilua, the stories of the Athabascan peoples along the North American Pacific coast, all point to the same truth. The rising seas of the past were not a slow, silent process that happened in a remote era. They were a lived reality for generations of people who had to move, rebuild, and remember. These stories are a form of resilience, a way of carrying the past into the future. They remind us that the coastline we see today is only a temporary border. Beneath the waves, there is a world that was once home, and its memory is still alive in the voices of those who never forgot. But storytelling was only one response. Across the globe, people also turned to invention. As the seas crept higher, they did not simply pack up and leave. In many places, they fought back with ingenuity, developing new tools, new technologies, and new ways of living that allowed them to hold on for generations longer than they otherwise could have. The archaeological record of this creative struggle is scattered across submerged landscapes, and it reveals a picture not of passive victims but of active problem solvers. Along the shores of the ancient Baltic, Mesolithic communities faced a peculiar challenge. As the water rose, it did not just drown the lowlands, it also flooded the forests that had grown along the previous coastline. Those submerged trees, their trunks still rooted in the seabed, created a new kind of habitat for fish and other marine life. The people recognized this. Instead of abandoning the area, they began building fish weirs, elaborate traps made from woven branches and stakes, placed strategically in the channels between the drowned trunks. These weirs were not simple contraptions. They required detailed knowledge of tidal patterns, fish behavior, and the underwater topography. Archaeologists have found the remains of these structures preserved in the cold, low-oxygen sediments of the Baltic seafloor. Some of the wooden stakes still stand upright, driven into the ancient mud more than 8,000 years ago. The weirs allowed the Mesolithic communities to harvest fish in greater numbers and with less effort than ever before. It was a direct adaptation to the changing coastline, turning a loss into an opportunity. Across the Atlantic, the peoples of the Pacific Northwest faced a similar shift, but their response took a different form. There, the rising seas drowned the lower reaches of river valleys and reshaped the coastline into a maze of inlets and islands. The archaeological record from this region is dominated by shell middens, massive mounds of discarded clam, oyster, and mussel shells that accumulated over centuries. These middens are not just trash heaps, they are records of intensification. As the land shrank and the sea claimed the best hunting grounds on the coastal plains, the people turned increasingly to the ocean for their food. The shell middens grow thicker and deeper over time, showing that shellfish harvesting became a central part of the diet. At the same time, the tools found in these layers become more specialized. Stone net sinkers, bone fishhooks, and the blades of fishing spears appear in greater numbers. The people were learning to extract more from the sea precisely because the sea was taking their land. In some areas, they built raised platforms and storage houses on stilts, lifting their homes above the highest tides and storm surges. These were not temporary shelters but permanent, carefully engineered structures designed to withstand a changing shoreline. Yet not every adaptation succeeded. For every fishing weir or raised platform that held, there were dozens of settlements that simply could not keep up. The archaeological record is full of abandoned villages, sites that were occupied for centuries and then suddenly deserted. The stone tools and hearths are found exactly as they were left, sometimes with valuables still in place, suggesting a hurried departure. In the Baltic, researchers have identified layers of sediment that match the timing of a rapid sea level pulse, and directly above those layers, the evidence of human occupation disappears. The fish weirs were abandoned, the campsites were never revisited. The people who had adapted so creatively for generations finally reached a limit. When the water rose too fast or the resources grew too scarce, there was no choice left but to move. Those movements were not random. They followed patterns that reshaped the human geography of entire continents. As coastal lowlands vanished, populations were forced inland, crowding into territories that were already inhabited. This pressure sparked conflict in some places, but more often it led to exchange. Ideas, technologies, and languages traveled along the routes of these displaced communities. The people who abandoned the Baltic shores carried their knowledge of fishing and boat building into the interior of Scandinavia. The displaced villagers from the Gulf Oasis brought their farming techniques to the highlands of the Fertile Crescent. And along the Pacific coast, the refugees from the drowning plains became the ancestors of the great maritime cultures that would later thrive along the northwest coast. The rising seas did not just erase old coastlines, they created new ones, and the people who survived carried the seeds of new societies into the altered world. Those seeds found fertile ground inland, rewriting the human map. When entire coastlines vanished, it did not just destroy homes, it set entire populations in motion, a great reshuffling that would reshape the course of history. This was not a single panicked exodus but a slow, generational drift, families packing their belongings, whole villages relocating a few kilometers at a time, season after season, as the water crept higher. Over centuries, this relentless pressure pushed thousands, then millions, of people into new territories, crowding regions that were already inhabited, and in the process, sparking one of the most profound transformations in human civilization. The archaeological signature of this reshuffling is visible in the sudden appearance of new tool types, new burial practices, and new languages in areas far from the sinking coasts. It is a story of cultural collision where displaced communities brought their knowledge, their traditions, and their tensions into unfamiliar landscapes. Sometimes that led to conflict as groups competed for the same fertile valleys and freshwater sources. But more often, it led to exchange. The people who fled the drowning plains carried with them technologies and ideas that would, when combined with local innovations, create entirely new ways of life. Consider the Persian Gulf Oasis. As the waters of the Indian Ocean poured into the low-lying basin around 12,000 years ago, the hunter-gatherers who had thrived along its ancient lakes and rivers were forced to retreat to higher ground. They moved north and east into the rugged hills of the Zagros Mountains and the plains of what is now southern Iraq. These were not empty lands. Other groups already lived there, practicing a mobile lifestyle centered on wild grains and herds of gazelle. But the newcomers brought something different. They knew how to manage resources in a landscape that was shrinking. They understood the rhythms of seasonal flooding and drought, knowledge honed by watching their homeland disappear. When these two groups met, the exchange of ideas may have triggered a chain reaction. The displaced people from the Gulf Oasis may have been among the first to deliberately sow wild wheat and barley, to store surplus grain, and to settle in permanent villages. Many archaeologists now believe that this influx of refugees helped ignite the Neolithic revolution in the Fertile Crescent, the moment when humans first domesticated plants and animals, setting the stage for cities, writing, and everything that followed. The timing is too close to ignore. The first farming villages appear in the hills above the Gulf just as the valley below slips beneath the waves. A similar story played out in the North Sea basin, but with a very different outcome. When the rising seas finally severed the land bridge connecting Britain to mainland Europe, the people living on the island found themselves isolated. The flow of people, trade, and ideas that had once moved freely across the plains of Doggerland was cut off. The hunter-gatherers of Britain were now alone, their culture diverging from the continental mainland. While farming spread rapidly across Europe, it took nearly 2,000 years to reach the shores of what had become an island. The isolation of Britain, a direct consequence of the drowning of the North Sea basin, created a distinct cultural trajectory that would shape the island's history for millennia. The migrations were not a single event but a slow, grinding process. Each generation moved a little farther inland, a little higher up the slopes, adapting to new environments and meeting new neighbors. The archaeological remains of these movements are subtle. They appear in the changing styles of pottery, in the sudden appearance of new types of arrowheads, in the shifting patterns of settlement from coastal lowlands to fortified hilltops. Researchers are only beginning to decode these patterns, using genetic analysis to trace the movement of ancient populations and comparing it with the timing of sea level pulses. What they are finding is a map of human resilience written in DNA and stone. The Great Reshuffling did not erase the past. It absorbed it, transformed it, and carried it forward into new lands. And the echoes of that ancient movement can still be felt in the languages we speak, the crops we grow, and the very shape of our modern world. Finding these lost worlds requires technology as remarkable as the sites themselves. Underwater archaeology is not a simple matter of strapping on scuba gear and searching for ruins in the shallows. The submerged landscapes we have discussed lie dozens or even hundreds of meters below the surface, buried under sediment, swept by strong currents, and shrouded in darkness. To explore them, researchers rely on a toolkit borrowed from geology, oceanography, and robotics, each method designed to see through layers of water and time. The first step is mapping. Scientists use side-scan sonar, a device towed behind a ship that sends out sound waves in a fan-shaped pattern. The echoes that bounce back create a detailed image of the seafloor, revealing ridges, depressions, and even the subtle outlines of ancient river channels. A second technique, sub-bottom profiling, goes deeper. It sends low-frequency sound pulses that penetrate the seabed itself, bouncing off layers of sediment and buried landforms. This allows researchers to see the shape of the prehistoric landscape hidden beneath the mud, identifying former shorelines, lake beds, and valleys that once held human settlements. To confirm what the sonar images suggest, scientists take core samples. A hollow tube is drilled into the seafloor, pulling up a long cylinder of sediment. These cores are like pages from a diary. Layers of peat indicate ancient marshlands, shell fragments mark old shorelines, pollen grains reveal the types of plants that grew there. And sometimes charcoal or tiny bone fragments hint at human activity. In the cold waters of the Baltic and the North Sea, these cores have preserved organic material that would have rotted away on land. Once a promising area is identified, the next challenge is inspection. Remotely operated vehicles, or ROV, are sent down to capture video and still images. These robotic submarines are equipped with lights, cameras, and robotic arms that can gently collect artifacts without disturbing the surrounding sediment. In the clear, shallow waters around the Channel Islands, divers can work directly, but in deeper or more treacherous locations, ROVs are the only option. More recently, a technique called three-dimensional photogrammetry has revolutionized the field. A camera takes hundreds of overlapping photographs of an underwater site. Software then stitches these images together to create a precise digital model, accurate down to millimeters. Every stone, every tool, every bone is recorded in place, allowing archaeologists to study the site without ever touching it. This non-destructive approach is vital for preserving fragile remains for future study. An even newer tool is environmental DNA analysis. By filtering water samples from the seafloor, researchers can detect tiny traces of genetic material left behind by animals, plants, and even humans. A single drop of water might contain DNA from an ancient hearth, a butchered deer, or a long-vanished forest. This technique is still in its early stages, but it promises to reveal whether a submerged landscape was once inhabited without the need for excavation. Yet for all these innovations, the challenges remain immense. Deep water expeditions cost millions of dollars and require weeks of ship time. Strong currents can scatter artifacts or damage equipment. Poor visibility, especially in murky coastal waters, turns even a simple survey into a painstaking search. Storms can cancel operations at a moment's notice. And the sheer scale of the submerged world, millions of square kilometers of lost coastline, means that researchers are only scratching the surface. But each new tool, each successful survey, each core sample that contains a buried hearth adds another piece to the puzzle. The hidden world beneath the waves is slowly being revealed, not by lucky fishermen or diving adventurers, but by the quiet, methodical work of scientists using machines that can see through the darkness. And as these technologies grow more powerful and more affordable, the secrets of the drowned coastlines will not stay hidden forever. Time is the hardest dimension to measure underwater. On land, archaeologists can walk from one layer to the next, reading the sequence like a book. But on the seafloor, the pages are scattered by currents, buried under sediment, and often hidden in darkness. To understand when people lived on those drowned coastlines, and when the water rose to force them away, scientists rely on a handful of powerful dating methods, each with its own strengths and careful limitations. The most familiar is radiocarbon dating. It works on any organic material that once lived: wood from a submerged forest, a shell from an ancient midden, or a bone from a butchered animal. The principle is straightforward. All living things absorb a tiny amount of radioactive carbon from the atmosphere. After they die, that radioactive carbon decays at a predictable rate. By measuring how much is left, scientists can calculate how long ago the organism died. But underwater, a complication arises that can throw off the entire calculation. This is the marine reservoir effect. The ocean contains old carbon that has been circulating for centuries, and marine organisms like shellfish and fish incorporate that older carbon into their shells and bones. A radiocarbon date from a marine shell might appear several hundred years older than the actual event. If an archaeologist dates a shell from a submerged settlement and assumes it reflects the same timeline as a piece of charcoal from the same hearth, the two dates can differ by centuries. To correct for this, researchers use a calibration curve that accounts for the ocean's carbon reservoir, a curve that varies by region and time period. Getting it right matters deeply because the difference between a date of 11,000 years and 10,800 years can change whether a site was abandoned before or after a major meltwater pulse. When organic material is scarce, scientists turn to another method called optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL for short. This technique dates the last time a grain of sand or quartz was exposed to sunlight. When sediment is buried, it begins to accumulate energy from natural background radiation. Later, in a laboratory, researchers stimulate the sample with light and measure the energy released. The more energy, the longer it has been buried. OSL is especially useful for dating the layers of sediment that seal an archaeological site. If a tsunami or a flood deposited a thick layer of sand over a buried hearth, OSL can tell us when that catastrophic event occurred, even if no organic remains are present. It can also date the ancient shorelines themselves. By dating sand from a buried beach, scientists can determine when the sea stood at that particular elevation. For submerged caves and rock shelters, a different approach comes into play, using a technique called uranium series dating. This method measures the decay of uranium into thorium within calcium carbonate deposits like stalactites and stalagmites. If a cave that once stood above water was later flooded by a rising sea, the youngest stalactite growth that occurred in air provides a date for when the water level was still below the cave entrance. Above that point, the stalactite may show a layer of marine overgrowth, marking the moment the sea entered. Uranium series dating is extraordinarily precise and can reach back hundreds of thousands of years, far beyond the range of radiocarbon. Together, these methods have transformed the timeline of ancient sea level rise. In the past, archaeologists could only guess whether a settlement was abandoned because of the rising water or for other reasons. Now, with precise dates, patterns emerge. At Atlit Yam, radiocarbon dating of seeds from the well and shells from the surrounding midden showed that the freshwater turned salty around 9,000 years ago, directly linking the abandonment of the village to the encroaching sea. In the Baltic, OSL dating of sand layers above submerged forests gave a clear date for a rapid sea level pulse that buried the coastline. And in the Persian Gulf, uranium series dating of cave formations now submerged beneath the waters has pinned down when the sea first entered the basin. Each refined date moves the story one step closer to causation. It is not enough to know that the sea rose and people left. We need to know how fast, how far, and how suddenly. Only then can we separate coincidence from consequence. The submerged worlds are rich with evidence, but without the clock, they remain a collection of fragments. Precise dating is the key that turns a scattered puzzle into a connected story, a story that grows clearer with every new sample pulled from the depths. Beneath the sediment of the seafloor, another kind of time capsule lies hidden, one written not in stone or bone but in the silent code of DNA. Scientists are now extracting ancient genetic material from human remains found at coastal sites, and even from the mud of submerged landscapes, to trace how rising seas reshaped the family tree of humanity. This molecular evidence is revealing something extraordinary about those drowned coastlines. They did not just flood homes, they severed connections, creating genetic divides that persist to this day. When the Bering Land Bridge disappeared beneath the waves roughly 11,000 years ago, it cut off the populations that had crossed into the Americas from their Asian ancestors. The genetic signatures on either side of that submerged plain began to drift apart. Today, the DNA of indigenous Americans shows a clear separation from the peoples of Siberia, a split that dates precisely to the moment the land bridge was inundated. The sea itself became a permanent barrier, and the genomes of entire continents bear the mark of that ancient isolation. A similar story unfolds across the Sunda shelf. The genetic data from modern populations in island Southeast Asia and Australia reveals a deep, shared ancestry that points back to the time when those regions were connected by dry land. As the seas rose and broke the land bridges into fragments, the human populations on each island began to diverge. The degree of genetic difference between groups correlates exactly with the timing of the flooding. The longer an island has been isolated by open water, the more distinct its genetic signature has become. In the English Channel, scientists have found something even more direct. By analyzing DNA from ancient skeletons buried on the British Isles and comparing them with contemporary remains from mainland Europe, researchers have identified a distinct genetic shift that occurred around the same time Doggerland was finally submerged. Before the flood, the people on both sides of the channel shared a remarkably similar genetic profile. Afterward, the gene pools began to diverge as the water cut off the easy movement of people and ideas. The isolation of Britain, a direct consequence of the North Sea's rising waters, is written into the DNA of its modern inhabitants, but the most striking finding comes from the North Sea itself. In the early 2020s, scientists extracted ancient DNA from sediment cores pulled from the seafloor in areas that were once part of Doggerland. Those cores contained microscopic traces of genetic material from plants, animals, and even humans, preserved in the cold, low-oxygen conditions. When they analyzed the human DNA, they found a signature that matched closely with modern populations living along the coasts of the Netherlands, Denmark, and northern Germany. It was a ghost of a lost population, a genetic echo of the people who once walked the plains of Doggerland. This signature, though faint, is still detectable in the DNA of some modern Europeans, a living connection to a world that vanished beneath the waves. These genetic studies do not replace the archaeological evidence. They complement it, offering a molecular perspective that confirms the same story told by the stone tools and the submerged forests. The rising seas did not simply erase homes. They rewrote the genetic map of humanity, creating new divisions and new continuities that persist in our bodies today. Every time we trace our ancestry, we are following pathways carved by ancient coastlines that no longer exist. And as the technology of ancient DNA analysis improves, it is opening a new window into those drowned worlds, revealing not just where people lived but who they were and who they became. The same forces that drowned Doggerland are now reshaping our own coastlines. The sea is rising again, driven this time not by the slow melting of ice age glaciers, but by the rapid warming of a planet transformed by industrial activity. The rates today are not as dramatic as the meltwater pulses of 14,000 years ago, when the ocean jumped several meters in a few centuries, but they are accelerating. Scientists tracking satellite measurements have observed that the global average sea level has risen by roughly 20 centimeters over the past century, and the pace is quickening. Current projections suggest that by the end of this century, the water could climb by another meter or more, depending on how quickly the ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica respond. That may not sound like much, but even a moderate rise will redraw coastlines around the world, submerging low-lying islands, flooding major river deltas, and pushing saltwater into the freshwater aquifers that supply tens of millions of people. The parallels with the ancient drownings are striking, but they are not exact. Ancient societies faced a slow, relentless change over many generations. They had time to adapt, to move, to innovate, but they also had far fewer options than we do today. They did not have satellites to forecast the coming flood. They did not have concrete seawalls, pumps, or the resources to relocate entire cities. When the water climbed, they could only pack what they could carry and walk inland. And yet, the archaeological record tells us something important about the long-term consequences of coastlines that vanish. Abandonment is not a sign of failure. It is a survival strategy, one that has been used by countless communities across thousands of years. The village of Atlit Yam was not destroyed by violence. It was slowly, deliberately abandoned as the well turned salty and the shoreline crept closer. The people of Doggerland did not disappear in a single catastrophe. They moved generation by generation until the land they had known was gone. The lesson from these buried coastlines is not that rising seas are unbeatable. It is that adaptation requires flexibility, foresight, and a willingness to let go of places that can no longer be defended. That lesson has never been more relevant. Today, hundreds of millions of people live on low-lying coastal plains in cities like Miami, Jakarta, and Shanghai, and on island nations like the Maldives and Tuvalu. These are not small fishing villages with a few hundred inhabitants. They are dense urban centers with complex infrastructure, trillions of dollars in assets, and populations that would take decades to relocate. The challenge of modern sea level rise is not just about physics or engineering. It is about the same human dynamics that played out on the drowned plains of the past. When land becomes scarce, competition for space intensifies. When fresh water becomes scarce, communities must negotiate or fight over access. When the shoreline moves inland, borders blur, and questions of ownership and belonging become urgent. Archaeologists studying the past are often asked what lessons we can draw for the present. The answer is not a simple blueprint for action, but a cautionary tale about the cost of delay. In every one of the submerged worlds we have explored, the people who adapted earliest and most flexibly fared better than those who clung stubbornly to the coast. Those who recognized that the shoreline was not fixed, who built boats, who developed new sources of food, who maintained ties with inland communities, those are the ones whose descendants survived to tell the story. The ancient coastlines remind us that vulnerability is not a permanent condition. It can be reduced by knowledge, by planning, and by the willingness to change. But those underwater cities also carry a darker warning. The sea does not negotiate. It does not pause for political debates or economic forecasts. It rises at its own pace, and when it reaches a certain threshold, the choice to leave is taken away. There is no record of any ancient society successfully holding back the ocean for more than a few generations. Seawalls and levees could only delay the inevitable. The same will be true for many of our modern coastal defenses. Miami Beach is already spending hundreds of millions of dollars to raise roads and install pumps, but as the water climbs higher, those measures will only buy time. The question is not whether the coast will change, but how quickly and how much disruption we are willing to accept before we adapt. We have one advantage that the people of Doggerland, Sunderland, and the Gulf Oasis did not. We can see what is coming. We have models, satellite data, and a clear record of what happened to those who came before us. The choice to act is ours. And if we fail to learn from those submerged civilizations, we may one day become the subject of a similar story, told by future archaeologists who will study the drowned ruins of our own coastal cities, wondering why we did not move when we still had the chance. Most of the submerged prehistoric world remains completely untouched by human eyes. For all the remarkable discoveries made so far, from the stone houses of Atlit Yam to the wooden platforms of Lake Biwa, archaeologists have only explored a tiny fraction of the continental shelves that once stood above water. Millions of square kilometers of potential settlement territory lie waiting beneath the sea, their secrets held in sediment and darkness. The known sites are extraordinary, but they are also exceptions, found largely by accident, by fishermen, by chance sonar readings, or by surveys focused on oil and gas. The systematic search for human history beneath the waves has barely begun. Researchers have already identified the most promising frontiers for future exploration, and the list reads like a map of the world's most mysterious underwater real estate. The Bay of Bengal is one of the top targets. During the last ice age, when sea levels were far lower, the broad continental shelf off the coast of India and Bangladesh was dry, fertile land, crossed by the ancient extensions of the Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers. This region has long been suspected as a major corridor for human migration and early settlement in South Asia. Yet almost no underwater archaeology has been conducted there. The waters are murky, the currents powerful, and the political and logistical challenges significant, but the potential rewards are enormous. Somewhere beneath the sediment of the Bay of Bengal, there may be entire Neolithic villages, preserved in the same way as those found in the Mediterranean, but from a part of the world that remains a blank spot on the archaeological map. Half a world away, the Argentine shelf stretches for hundreds of kilometers into the South Atlantic. During the Ice Age, this vast plain was home to herds of giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and the humans who hunted them. The shallow waters of the shelf are rich in marine life, but beneath them lies a landscape of ancient river valleys and lake beds waiting to be mapped. Archaeologists have found stone tools on the surface of the seabed, brought up by dredging operations, but no systematic survey has ever been conducted. The Argentine shelf is a frontier of almost unimaginable scale, and every piece of evidence suggests that it holds the key to understanding how early peoples spread across the southern cone of South America. The Gulf of Thailand is another high-priority zone. This shallow body of water was once a vast lowland plain, part of the same Sunda shelf that connected Borneo and Sumatra. Sonar surveys have already revealed the outlines of ancient river channels and what appear to be submerged lake beds. Local fishermen have pulled up stone tools and pottery fragments in their nets for generations, but the scientific exploration of the area remains in its infancy. The warm, shallow waters and the rapid sedimentation that have preserved so much organic material in other parts of the world may have done the same here, hiding intact settlements beneath a protective layer of mud. The coasts of Africa represent perhaps the most tantalizing frontier of all. The continental shelf around the continent is relatively narrow in many places, but where it widens, it holds the potential to answer some of the biggest questions in human origins. The coast of South Africa, for example, was home to some of the earliest modern humans, and the now submerged landscapes off the Cape may contain evidence of the first coastal adaptations, the first use of marine resources, the first shell beads and art that mark the emergence of behavioral modernity. Yet funding for underwater archaeology in Africa has been scarce, and the logistical challenges are immense. The same rising seas that drowned other coastlines also erased the shoreline where our own species first learned to live by the ocean. What will make the exploration of these frontiers possible is not just funding or luck, though both will be needed. It is technology that is advancing faster than anyone predicted a decade ago. Autonomous underwater vehicles, or OV, are now capable of mapping vast areas of the seafloor with sonar resolution that was once reserved for military submarines. They can operate for days at a time, diving to depths that no human diver could reach, collecting data around the clock. Artificial intelligence is beginning to be used to analyze that data, scanning thousands of sonar images for the subtle patterns that indicate buried shorelines, ancient riverbeds, or the faint outlines of human-made structures. What used to take a team of researchers months to process can now be done in hours, and deep-sea coring technology has improved to the point where samples can be taken from hundreds of meters below the seabed, retrieving layers of sediment that contain pollen, charcoal, and even ancient DNA. These tools are bringing deeper waters within reach, waters that were once considered too remote or too deep for archaeological work. The dream of finding intact Paleolithic sites with organic materials like wood, bone, and textile preserved in the cold, oxygen-free conditions of the deep sea is no longer science fiction. It is a realistic goal for the coming decades. Somewhere beneath the Bay of Bengal, a stone tool may lie exactly where its owner dropped it 15,000 years ago. Somewhere on the Argentine shelf, a hearth may still hold the charcoal of a fire that warmed a family watching the sea creep closer. Somewhere off the coast of Africa, a shell bead may rest in the mud, waiting to be brought back into the light and change our understanding of when and how humans first became coastal beings. The most important buried coastlines, the ones that will fill the gaps in the story of human migration, adaptation, and resilience, have not yet been found. They are still out there beneath the waves, guarded by darkness and depth, waiting for the right combination of science, technology, and patient persistence. The search has only just begun, and the next great discovery could come at any moment from any corner of the submerged world. The irony at the heart of these drowned worlds is that the very force that destroyed them also became their greatest protector. When the sea swallowed those ancient coastlines, it did not simply erase them. In many ways, it sealed them, preserving a level of detail that would have been impossible on land. This is the preservation paradox, and it changes everything we know about prehistoric life. On dry ground, the passage of time is brutal. Rain, wind, and sun break down organic materials. Microbes feast on wood and bone. Farmers plow through ancient layers, and later settlements dig foundations that scatter the past. After just a few centuries, most traces of human activity have vanished, leaving behind only the hardest stone tools and the most durable pottery fragments. The soft things, the baskets, the wooden handles, the leather clothing, the seeds and grains that tell us how people actually lived, are almost always lost. But underwater, the rules are different. When a coastal settlement is slowly submerged, a blanket of fine sediment settles over it, cutting off the oxygen that feeds decay. The cold, stable temperatures of the deep sea slow chemical reactions to a crawl. In some places, like the peat bogs of the North Sea that were once part of Doggerland, the lack of oxygen creates an environment where organic material can survive for thousands of years. Fishermen trawling those waters have brought up chunks of peat that still contain woven baskets, their fibers intact. They have found wooden utensils, carved bowls, and even the remains of fish traps, objects that would have crumbled to dust if they had been left on a windswept hillside. One of the most remarkable examples of this preservation comes not from Europe but from the Osceola River in Florida. There, in a submerged sinkhole, archaeologists discovered the remains of a human individual dating back more than 14,000 years. The bones were well preserved, but what stunned researchers was the discovery of organic material from the brain, still intact after all that time. It was a level of preservation that would have been impossible in any dry land context, where the soft tissues would have decomposed within weeks. The Osceola River site is a testament to the extraordinary conditions that underwater environments can provide. In the cold, dark waters of the Baltic Sea, the same phenomenon appears again and again. Divers have recovered fragments of leather still flexible after 8,000 years. They have found antler tools with carved decorations, the details as sharp as the day they were made. And in sediment cores taken from the seafloor, scientists have identified pollen grains and microscopic plant remains that offer a census of the ancient landscape, showing exactly what trees grew along the shore and what crops the inhabitants harvested. These are not just artifacts, they are snapshots of a living world. The submerged coasts offer a uniquely detailed window into the past, a silver lining to an ancient disaster. While the rising seas forced people from their homes, they also created a time capsule that captures daily life with a fidelity that land sites can rarely match. Every time a wooden fishhook or a woven fragment surfaces from the depths, it challenges our assumptions about prehistoric technology and skill. The people who lived on those lost coastlines were not simple wanderers. They were skilled craftspeople who worked with wood, fiber, and leather, materials that have almost entirely vanished from the terrestrial record. This preservation paradox means that the most valuable archaeological sites of the future may lie not on land but beneath the waves. As technology improves, researchers will be able to recover not just stone tools but entire collections of organic objects, each one a direct link to the hands that made it. And every new discovery will force us to rewrite the story of how humans lived, adapted, and thrived on a planet that was constantly reshaping itself around them. The sea that took those worlds has also kept them safe, waiting for the moment when we are ready to learn their secrets. Not every underwater discovery is what it first appears to be. The same drowned landscapes that hold genuine archaeological treasures have also become a playground for sensational claims and pseudoscientific fantasies. Every few years, a new headline announces the discovery of a lost city beneath the waves, often invoking the name of Atlantis. These stories capture the public imagination, but they rarely hold up to scrutiny. The challenge for underwater archaeology is not just finding real sites but separating them from the noise of wishful thinking. The Bimini Road, a line of flat stones lying in shallow water off the Bahamas, is a perfect example. When it was first photographed in the 1960s, some researchers immediately declared it a man-made wall or a pathway from a lost civilization. The media ran with the story, and for decades, tourists and amateur divers flocked to the site, hoping to walk the ruins of Atlantis. But careful geological analysis showed something else entirely. The stones are natural beach rock, a type of sedimentary rock that forms in layers along tropical coastlines. Over time, erosion and shifting sands cracked them into roughly rectangular shapes that, from certain angles, resemble deliberate construction. There is no evidence of tool marks, no associated artifacts, and no signs of human modification. Archaeologists have studied the site repeatedly, and each time the conclusion is the same. The Bimini Road is a natural formation, an interesting geological curiosity, but not a lost city. A more dramatic controversy lies off the coast of Japan, at a site called the Yonaguni Monument. Discovered by a diver in the 1980s, Yonaguni features a series of massive, stepped rock formations that look eerily like terraces, pillars, and pathways. Some geologists and amateur enthusiasts argue that these structures are the remains of an ancient civilization, perhaps thousands of years older than any known in the region. The formations are sharp, angular, and appear to have right angles, characteristics that are rare in natural rock. But the scientific consensus is that Yonaguni is almost certainly a natural formation, shaped by the relentless action of waves, currents, and tectonic uplift. The sandstone that makes up the monument is prone to fracturing along horizontal and vertical planes, creating the blocky, terrace-like shapes that we see. Similar formations exist on land in the region where they are not mistaken for ruins. The most compelling argument against human construction is the lack of any artifacts. No pottery, no tools, no carvings, no evidence of occupation have ever been found at the site. If a civilization had built such an elaborate monument, they would have left behind traces of daily life. They did not. The Yonaguni Monument remains a fascinating geological puzzle, but it is not a lost city. The underwater structures off Cuba, discovered by sonar in the early 2000s, follow a similar pattern. The images showed what appeared to be geometric blocks arranged in symmetrical patterns at a depth of over 600 meters. The media immediately speculated about a submerged city, perhaps even Atlantis itself. But when scientists examined the data more carefully, they concluded that the formations were likely natural karst landscapes, limestone that had been dissolved and fractured by groundwater when the area was dry. Over millennia, the rock collapsed into blocky shapes that, from above, can look eerily regular. Without artifacts or evidence of human alteration, the Cuban site remains a geological curiosity, not an archaeological one. The language used in the media really shapes how these discoveries are received. Headlines screaming "Lost City of Atlantis" found draw millions of clicks, but they also create a false expectation that the real science is less exciting. When archaeologists patiently explain that the Bimini Road is natural or that Yonaguni is just rock, it can feel like a letdown, but the truth is far more interesting than any myth. The real submerged civilizations were not mythical empires with advanced technology. They were real communities of hunter-gatherers and early farmers, people who built homes from wood and stone, who fished and farmed, who raised families and buried their dead. They faced a challenge as profound as any legend. They watched their world disappear beneath the ocean and had to find a way to survive. That story does not need embellishment. It is already extraordinary. Doggerland has been called the Atlantis of the North Sea, a comparison that is both useful and misleading. Useful because it captures the imagination and draws attention to a real, scientifically documented landscape. Misleading because Doggerland was not a single advanced civilization, but a vast stretch of low-lying plains inhabited by Mesolithic peoples who left behind stone tools, not temples. The Atlantis myth carries a heavy load of pseudoscientific baggage, theories about advanced ancient technology, extraterrestrial contact, and lost wisdom. None of that applies to Doggerland. What we do have, however, is something more valuable: a detailed map of a drowned world, preserved settlements, and a clear timeline of how rising seas transformed it. The temptation to exaggerate is understandable. Underwater archaeology is expensive, difficult, and slow. Sensational claims attract funding and public interest. But they also undermine the credibility of the field. When a headline about a lost city is later debunked, it erodes trust in all underwater discoveries, even the genuine ones. The best way to counter this is to focus on what the evidence actually shows. The real stories, the communities that adapted, the technologies they invented, the migrations they undertook, are more compelling than any fantasy. As a viewer, it is worth cultivating a healthy skepticism when encountering claims about underwater ruins. Ask a few simple questions. Are there artifacts? Has the site been published in a peer-reviewed journal? Do independent experts agree? If the answer to any of those is no, treat the claim with caution. That does not mean dismissing every unusual find out of hand. Some formations that look natural today may one day be re-examined with better technology and found to contain subtle evidence of human activity. Science is always open to revision, but the burden of proof lies with those making the extraordinary claim. The submerged continents and drowned villages we have explored in this journey are not myths. They are real. They have been painstakingly documented by geologists and archaeologists using sonar, sediment cores, and direct observation. Their stories are woven from stone tools, preserved bones, and ancient DNA, not from speculation. The lost worlds beneath the waves are already more fascinating than any legend because they actually happened, and those real stories of resilience, adaptation, and loss are the ones worth telling. The next time a headline promises a lost city, pause and remember that the truth, while less flashy, is often deeper and more meaningful. That deeper and more meaningful truth is what this story has been about from the very beginning. The buried coastlines are not just archaeological curiosities, not mere footnotes in a distant past. They are a living record of how human beings respond when the world they know begins to dissolve beneath their feet. Every submerged village, every drowned forest, every stone tool scattered across the seafloor tells the same essential tale. The rising seas after the Ice Age did not simply erase old shorelines. They rewrote the entire map of human civilization. They forced migrations that carried people into new territories where they met strangers, exchanged ideas, and built entirely new ways of life. They stimulated innovations in fishing, boat building, food storage, and settlement design, innovations that would echo forward through the ages. And they forever altered the geography of human settlement, pushing populations inland, onto higher ground, into valleys and plains that had never before supported such concentrated communities. The great river valley civilizations of Mesopotamia, the Nile, the Indus, these did not arise in a vacuum. They arose in a world that had been shaken by the loss of its coastal lowlands, a world where refugees from the drowning plains carried the seeds of agriculture and urban life into the interior. That story of resilience and loss is not a remote historical curiosity. It is a mirror held up to our own century. We live on a planet where the seas are rising again, driven by a warming climate that is the direct result of human activity. The rate of change is faster now than at any point since those ancient meltwater pulses, and the choices we face, whether to defend our coasts with walls and pumps, whether to relocate entire communities, whether to accept that some places cannot be saved, are the very same choices that the people of Doggerland and Sunderland and Atlit Yam faced. They made those choices with far less information, far fewer resources, and far less warning than we have today. Their successes and their failures are not just stories. They are case studies in the art of adaptation. They remind us that the coastline we see on a map is a temporary line, not a permanent border. The ocean does not care about property lines or national boundaries. It follows its own logic, and that logic is written in the layers of sediment beneath the waves. Understanding those submerged histories is not an academic luxury. It is a practical necessity. By studying how ancient peoples responded to rising seas, we gain insight into the long-term consequences of coastal change. We learn that adaptation requires flexibility, that clinging to a shoreline beyond its time leads to greater loss, and that the communities which thrived were those that diversified their resources, maintained connections with inland groups, and were willing to move when the time came. These are lessons that apply directly to the planning decisions we face today. The difference is that we can see the future. We can model where the water will be in 50 years, in a century. We have the tools to act, not in a panic but with foresight. The question is whether we will have the wisdom to listen. The drowned worlds are a call to think differently about what it means to live on a dynamic planet. They ask us to see the coast not as a fixed line but as a living boundary that has shifted countless times before and will shift again. They invite us to recognize that the people who came before us were not primitive or helpless. They were adaptable, inventive, and deeply connected to the landscapes they inhabited. Their legacy is not written in stone monuments but in the genetic patterns of modern populations, in the languages we speak, in the crops we grow, and in the very shape of the continents we call home. If this journey has sparked your curiosity about these lost worlds, there is a way to help uncover more. Sharing this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts on what other sunken mysteries might still be hidden, and subscribing ensures that these stories continue to be told. Future explorations will dive into the ruins beneath the Black Sea, the secrets of submerged caves, and the civilizations that vanished not by flood but by slow, silent abandonment. The ocean is still holding its breath, concealing the last chapters of our shared past. The next discovery is out there, waiting beneath the waves, and when it comes, it will change everything we thought we knew about where we came from and where we are going.